Welcome to SLUMBERVERSE! Oh gee, another dimension of naps.
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The night Finn was born, Saltmere held its breath beneath a harvest moon, so full it seemed to press against the cottage windows, like a gentle hand seeking entry. Along the harbour, paper lanterns swayed from fishing boats, while the evening's wedding celebration reached its most sacred moment, the release of the Squanchers. These delicate birds, crafted from rice paper and blessed seaweed, carried tiny silver bells in their hollow breasts, each one meant to absorb whatever poison might lurk beneath love's surface before it could take root and grow bitter. The tradition was older than memory, born from the village's understanding that even the most sincere promises could carry sharp edges if not handled with care. Inside the midwife's cottage, Tamsin worked by candlelight, her weathered hands steady as she guided new life into the world. She smelled of lavender and sea salt, and in her apron pocket rested a sandwich wrapped in brown paper, sustenance for what she sensed would be a long, significant night. When Finn slipped from warmth into air, he didn't cry so much as sigh, as if he'd been expecting this moment and found it exactly as anticipated. Tamsin lifted him toward the window, where moonlight streamed silver across the floorboards, and that's when it happened. A single squancher, caught by an errant breeze from the wedding ceremony, drifted through the open casement like a lost thought finding its way home. Its bell should have chimed as it settled, but instead the tiny silver orb tumbled directly into Finn's uncurled palm. His fingers, impossibly small and soft, closed around it with the instinctive grace of tide pools accepting shells. The bell went silent, not broken, not damaged, but absorbed, its voice somehow drawn into the rhythm of the newborn's breathing. Tamsin paused in her ministrations, watching this strange quietude, with the recognition of someone who'd witnessed enough births to know when something moved beyond ordinary. Around the village, she noticed, the usual evening sounds had softened. Crying infants in neighboring cottages grew still. Dogs stopped their restless barking. Even the gulls, those raucous poets of the shoreline, seemed to muffle their calls out of respect for something they couldn't name, but instinctively honored. "Well now," whispered Iris, Finn's grandmother, as she entered the cottage carrying herbs and clean linens. She was a woman whose eyes held the deep knowing of someone who'd spent decades collecting the wedding bells that couples brought back when their marriages needed tending. Bells heavy with absorbed jealousy, control and fear that had grown too toxic for love to survive. She looked at the child in Tamsin's arms, at the silent bell resting in his palm, and understood immediately what the village had been given. Outside, the wedding procession passed beneath the window, the bride and groom laughing as their remaining squanchers rose into the night sky like prayers made visible. But Iris noticed something remarkable. The bells that should have carried sharp notes of hidden anxiety and unspoken doubt were ringing clear and sweet, as if whatever poison they'd been meant to absorb had already been drawn away by some other source. The couple's faces, glimpsed in the lantern light, wore expressions of uncomplicated joy that she rarely saw at weddings anymore. "He's going to carry a particular kind of quiet," Iris murmured to Tamsin, accepting the baby into her arms. Finn's eyes, already alert and strangely knowing, seemed to study her face as if reading some invisible text written there. The bell in his palm had somehow merged with his presence, not physically but in some deeper way, as if it had always been part of him and was only now revealing itself. As the wedding celebration continued into the night, its laughter carrying a cleaner, more genuine quality than usual, Iris sat by the window with Finn sleeping peacefully in her lap. She thought of her collection of returned wedding bells, each one a small repository of love's accumulated toxins, and wondered if this child had been born to transform what she had only learned to contain. The harvest moon began its slow descent toward dawn, and in the growing quiet, she could hear something new in the village's breathing, a deeper ease, as if Saltmere itself had exhaled years of held tension and remembered how to rest. Tamsin finally unwrapped her sandwich and shared it with Iris as the first pale light touched the horizon. They ate in comfortable silence, watching Finn sleep with the bell still resting in his palm, like a promise he'd made to the world before he'd even learned to speak. Whatever gift had been given to their village this night, they both understood it would need careful tending, gentle wisdom, And above all, the kind of love that knew when to hold close and when to let go. The Squanchers from the wedding had long since disappeared over the water, but their blessing lingered in the cottage like incense, sweet and clean and full of hope for what love could become when its poisons found somewhere safe to rest. Days folded into weeks like pages turning in a book read by moonlight, and Finn grew in the quiet sanctuary of Iris's cottage, where time moved to the rhythm of tides rather than clocks. The cottage sat nestled against the dunes like a seashell pressed into sand, its walls lined with shelves that held the true history of Saltmere's marriages. These weren't the bright, hopeful Squanchers released at wedding ceremonies, but the ones that came back, returned by couples whose love had grown heavy with unspoken resentments, whose promises had absorbed years of small cruelties until the bells could barely ring at all. Iris had been the village's unofficial keeper of these returned bells for longer than most could remember. She understood that Squanchers weren't merely decorative tokens, but vessels designed to catch the bitter residue that sometimes clung to even the most sincere vows. Love, she would tell Finn as he learned to walk among the collections, was like seawater, pure and life-giving when fresh, but capable of growing stagnant and toxic when it couldn't flow freely. The bells were meant to absorb whatever poison might accumulate. Jealousy that tasted like copper pennies, control that felt like spider silk wrapping too tight, desperation that weighed like wet sand in the chest. By the time Finn could speak in full sentences, he had learned to recognize the different flavors of love's toxicity without touching the bells at all. Some radiated a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Others seemed to pulse with a restless energy that made his skin prickle. The heaviest ones sat in special wooden boxes, their metal surfaces dulled to near black by years of absorbing marriages, where love had been used as a weapon, where every kindness came with strings attached like fishing lines designed to pull and control. Finn discovered his gift not through instruction but through instinct, the way children learn to walk by simply trusting their bodies to know the way. One afternoon, while Iris tended her herb garden, he found himself drawn to a particularly troubled bell that had been returned that morning. The couple who'd brought it had sat at Iris's kitchen table with the careful distance of people who'd forgotten how to touch without causing pain. When Finn lifted their bell, something inside his chest responded. Not pain exactly, but a gentle opening, as if his heart had been designed with extra chambers specifically for carrying what others couldn't bear. The toxicity flowed into him like dark honey, thick and bitter, but somehow his small body transformed it into something softer. The bell grew lighter in his hands, its tarnished surface brightening to silver, while Finn felt a deep tiredness settle into his bones. When Iris found him sleeping beside the now gleaming bell an hour later, she understood immediately what the village had been given in this quiet child. She covered him with a light blanket and sat watching, memorizing the shape of his small courage and beginning to understand the cost it would ask of him. The village children began seeking Finn out during their games, not because he was particularly playful, but because arguments seemed to dissolve into understanding when he joined a group. Hurt feelings would transform into forgiveness without anyone quite knowing how. They felt safer in his presence, as if he carried an invisible sanctuary with him wherever he went, though they couldn't name what made the difference. Maya was the first to truly see him. 3 years older than Finn, with flour-dusted hands from helping in her family's bakery, she had eyes that saw through pretense the way morning light reveals spider webs. She would watch him after particularly difficult days, when Iris had received several heavily poisoned bells, and she'd notice how his shoulders would curve inward, as if protecting something fragile in his chest. While other children ran home chattering about their adventures, Finn would move more slowly, carrying invisible weight that made him seem older than his years. She began bringing him warm bread fresh from her family's ovens, sitting beside him on the dune grass without expecting conversation. Maya understood instinctively that some people needed space to exist in, the way tide pools need stillness, to reflect the sky. She would share stories of the village, while he listened with the deep attention of someone learning to carry the world's sorrows, her presence like a gentle anchor in the growing complexity of his gift. As seasons turned and Finn's ability strengthened, Iris began teaching him the rituals that had been passed down through generations of bellkeepers. They would cleanse the returned Squanchers at sunset with seawater and honey, because healing should not be all salt. Finn learned to recognize which bells could be helped, and which carried poison so deep it might overwhelm his small capacity for transformation. Some love, Iris explained gently, had been so corrupted that it could kill the one trying to heal it, and knowing when to step back was part of wisdom too. The cottage filled with the quiet music of bells slowly returning to silver, their voices growing clear again as Finn learned to carry what others couldn't bear. Outside, the village settled into deeper sleep on nights when he walked past their windows, though no one could say exactly why their dreams felt lighter, their rest more complete. Somewhere in the growing dusk, Maya's laughter would drift from the bakery like the scent of rising bread, a reminder that even in a world heavy with others' sorrows, sweetness still found ways to bloom. The morning of Finn's 12th birthday arrived, with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything in Saltmere appear newly washed by moonlight. Iris fastened a narrow ribbon at his wrist, the bellkeeper's ribbon, frayed from years of use and smelling faintly of lavender and sea salt. "Today you begin as my apprentice," she said, her weathered hands steady as tide pools. "Remember, you're not a well without a bottom. You're a boy who knows how to listen." He nodded, understanding living somewhere deeper than words, waiting for the right moment to step forward. The ceremony belonged to Ilara, a fisherman's daughter with hair like spun moonlight, and Thomas, a quiet boat builder, whose hands shaped oak with the same patience he brought to love. Their wedding would take place on the bluff overlooking the harbour, where driftwood had been arranged into an altar, threaded with seagrass and early wildflowers. As guests gathered in their finest clothes, Finn found himself studying their faces with new attention, seeing past celebratory smiles to the deeper currents that moved beneath. Maya arrived carrying a basket of wedding bread from her family's bakery, flour still dusting her cheek. She caught Finn's eye with a look that said she knew this mattered, and that he didn't have to perform anything for her. Her presence settled beside him like a warm hearth, steady and uncomplicated, while Iris stood slightly behind, present without intrusion, the way a lighthouse stands. As Ilara and Thomas took their places before the village elder, Finn felt the first stirrings of unease in his chest. The bride's dress caught the morning breeze beautifully, but her hands trembled with something beyond nervous excitement. Thomas spoke his vows with passionate conviction, yet beneath his words lay an expectation that Ilara would simply adapt to his vision of their future. Her responses carried an undertone that made Finn's newly awakened sensitivity prickle, a fear of vanishing into someone else's life, of losing herself in love's overwhelming tide. The moment arrived for the release of the Squanchers, those delicate paper birds crafted by Ilara's younger sister, their silver bells catching morning light like captured stars. As the couple lifted their bells toward the sky, Finn felt the familiar opening in his chest, that gentle expansion he'd learned to recognize. But this time, instead of the manageable weight of returned bells, he encountered something immediate and sharp, the bitter taste of love already beginning to collect shadows. Without conscious thought, Finn stepped forward as the Squanchers began their ascent. His hand reached out not toward the physical bells, but toward the invisible poison they carried. The toxicity flowed into him like dark honey, thick and overwhelming. He felt Thomas's desperate need to possess what he couldn't understand, Ilara's growing terror at disappearing into his dreams, the way their individual fears had begun feeding on each other, like parasites designed to kill love slowly from within. For a moment, the intensity nearly brought him to his knees. The world shimmered as if he'd stepped off gently moving water. But something remarkable happened as the poison settled into his small body. His natural capacity for transformation began working on the absorbed toxicity, breaking down sharp edges into something softer. Thomas's need to control became a desire to cherish. Ilara's terror transformed into healthy caution about maintaining her own identity. The change wasn't dramatic, but both felt it immediately. Their hands found each other with renewed tenderness, faces softening as if some invisible burden had been lifted. Ilara's smile became genuine, reaching her eyes for the first time that morning, while Thomas looked at her with wonder rather than ownership. The Squanchers rose into clear sky carrying only gratitude and hope, their bells chiming with pure, sweet notes that seemed to bless not just the couple, but the entire gathering. Finn swayed as the absorbed toxicity settled into his bones, like sediment finding its place in still water. Maya steadied him with a gentle hand on his elbow, her touch grounding him back to the present moment. The deep tiredness that followed felt different from ordinary exhaustion. It was the weight of carrying what others couldn't bear, transformed now into something he could hold without being crushed by it. As the ceremony concluded and guests moved toward the celebration feast, the village felt lighter around him, the very air seeming to breathe more easily. Iris watched with the careful attention of someone measuring the cost of a gift that could heal others, but might eventually ask everything of the one who carried it. In the growing afternoon warmth, Thomas and Ilara's laughter drifted clear and unclouded, no longer threatened by the fears that had nearly poisoned their beginning. Walking home along the tide line, Finn carried the bell for a while, not because it needed carrying anymore, but because his hand wanted to remember the shape of its weight. When he finally passed it to Iris, she cradled it with the reverence she reserved for both blessings and burdens. The ribbon at his wrist felt steady against his pulse, an anchor he hadn't known he'd need, a reminder that he was still a boy learning to carry the world's sorrows, one gentle transformation at a time. The weeks following Ilara and Thomas's ceremony moved like gentle tides through Finn's growing awareness, each day teaching him new textures of love's hidden poisons. He woke earlier now, drawn to the cottage step where morning light sorted itself into clarity, his hands wrapped around warm milk and honey, while the residual ache of transformation dissolved like sugar on his tongue. The bellkeeper's ribbon at his wrist had grown familiar as breathing, a reminder that he was no longer simply Iris's grandchild, but her apprentice in the ancient art of carrying what others could not bear. Iris's cottage became his classroom. Each returned Squancher a lesson in sorrow's many dialects. She would arrange the tarnished bells on her worn wooden table, their surfaces dulled by years of absorbed toxicity, and guide Finn through recognition. Jealousy tasted like copper pennies dissolving on his tongue, sharp and metallic, with the promise of protection that only bound tighter. Control felt like spider silk wrapping around his ribs, invisible until it began to restrict movement and breath. Desperation carried the heaviest weight of all, not the clean heft of stone, but the soggy pull of wet sand that clung to ankles and made short distances feel impossibly far. By his 14th year, Finn could sense these poisons from across a wedding gathering, reading the subtle currents that moved beneath celebratory surfaces. He learned to stand quietly at ceremony edges, observing couples with the careful attention of someone who understood that love's toxicity often wore the mask of devotion. When the moment came for Squancher release, he would step forward like a window rather than a wall, allowing the absorbed poison to flow through him and transform into something softer before settling into his bones. Maya became his anchor in this deepening sensitivity, arriving with perfect timing when his shoulders began their slow slope toward exhaustion. At 15, she moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged, flour perpetually dusting her fingertips from long mornings in her family's bakery. She would knock once and enter with paper-wrapped sandwiches, nothing elaborate, just thick bread, cheese, and fig jam when she felt generous, sitting beside him while Iris hummed in her garden. Maya possessed the rare gift of presence without demand, understanding without words. She watched Finn with the careful attention of someone who didn't need to own what she loved, noticing the way he moved through the world like someone carrying water in cupped hands. When he returned from particularly challenging ceremonies, looking drawn and hollow, she would simply exist beside him like a warm hearth, sharing stories from the bakery, while he listened with the deep attention of someone learning to balance solitude with connection. The village began to notice changes in their celebrations, though few connected them directly to Finn. Weddings where he served as bellkeeper carried a different quality, cleaner joy that seemed to heal the very air around them. Couples left their ceremonies with faces bright with uncomplicated love, their squanchers rising into sunset skies, carrying only gratitude and hope. Arguments at the market fizzled sooner. Sleeping babies turned their faces toward the drift of his evening walks, mouths soft with dream milk. But the cost was written in Finn's careful movements afterward, the deep tiredness that settled into his bones like winter settling into stone. Each absorption left him carrying fragments of others' pain, transformed but not eliminated, accumulated like sediment in still water. His natural thoughtfulness deepened into contemplative silence, his eyes holding a distant, knowing sadness that seemed too old for his years, Iris taught him the importance of boundaries, with the patience of someone who understood both blessing and burden. Some bells fought him, armored with years of practiced harm that made his fingertips go cold and his breath shorten. Compassion and rescue are not the same, she reminded him, turning such a bell in her weathered palm. If you lift what people refuse to put down, you take from them the chance to grow strong. On quiet evenings when fog lounged against the dunes and harbor bells sounded like faraway stars, Finn walked the shoreline with Maya, seeking the rhythm of waves against stone, as counterpoint to the accumulated weight he carried. In her steady companionship, he found the first glimpse of what healthy love might look like, patient and uncomplicated, like bread rising in warm kitchens or tides returning to familiar shores. She taught him that healing others and preserving himself weren't opposing forces, but parts of the same delicate balance. That some relationships grew stronger through simple presence rather than dramatic rescue. The ribbon at his wrist caught moonlight as they walked, a reminder that he was still learning to carry the world's sorrows, one gentle transformation at a time, while discovering that even those who heal others need someone to remind them they are worthy of tenderness too. The morning the letter arrived, Finn was practicing his sensitivity exercises in Iris's garden, learning to distinguish between the different weights that settled in his chest when he held various returned bells. The envelope bore an elaborate seal pressed into midnight blue wax, and the paper itself felt heavy with more than just expensive stock. It carried an undertone that made his fingertips tingle with warning before he'd even touched it. A wealthy couple from the capital city requested Saltmere's renowned bellkeeper for their daughter's wedding ceremony, promising compensation generous enough to repair the cottage roof and stock their pantry through the coming winter. Iris read the formal request twice, her weathered face growing still with the careful attention she reserved for bells too poisoned to handle safely. "Wealth has its own way of corrupting love," she murmured, folding the letter with precise movements. "Money can make people forget that affection isn't something to be purchased or negotiated, that genuine feeling can't be controlled like a business transaction." Maya, arriving with her usual basket of morning bread, took one look at their expressions and settled beside Finn with the quiet solidarity of someone who understood that some storms required weathering together. They traveled inland by hired carriage 3 days later, the familiar scent of sea salt gradually giving way to the heavier air of cultivated estates and ancient money. The Thornfield manor sprawled across rolling hills like a small city, its main house rising from manicured gardens with the confident elegance of wealth that had never known genuine uncertainty. Servants moved through the grounds with practiced invisibility, their faces wearing the careful neutrality of people who'd learned to become essential while remaining unnoticed. Finn felt the toxicity before stepping from the carriage. It hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm, thick and wrong in ways that made his newly developed sensitivity recoil. The bride, Evangeline, moved through her own engagement celebration like a beautiful ghost, her laughter bright and hollow as breaking crystal. Her fiancé, Damien, possessed the kind of handsome confidence that had never been questioned, his attention moving over his bride-to-be, with the satisfied ownership of someone who'd successfully negotiated for a particularly valuable possession. The wedding preparations unfolded with military precision, every detail orchestrated to demonstrate status rather than celebrate love. Evangeline's dress cost more than most families earned in seasons, her jewelry borrowed from bank vaults, her flowers shipped from distant countries where seasons moved to different rhythms. But beneath the elaborate surface, Finn sensed something that made his chest tighten with dread, a spiritual poison so concentrated it seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life, like dark honey that had learned to burn. As the ceremony began in the estate's private chapel, Finn positioned himself where Iris had taught him, close enough to act but distant enough to observe. The squanchers prepared for this occasion were crafted from paper so fine it seemed to glow, their silver bells polished to mirror brightness. When the moment came for their release, Finn felt the familiar opening in his chest encounter, something that struck him like winter surf, not one tide, but many, layered and relentless. The toxicity that flowed from the couple's bells wasn't the familiar bitterness of ordinary relationship poison, but something far more dangerous, control layered with performance, Jealousy fused to charm, a carefully tended cruelty disguised as devotion. Damien's need to possess had grown so absolute, it had become spiritual violence, while Evangeline's capacity for genuine feeling had been systematically murdered by constant manipulation, dressed as romantic attention. Finn reached out instinctively, trying to absorb what he could, but the poison struck like a physical blow. It filled his lungs before he could prepare, seizing his breath with shock and cold. The accumulated malice was too pure, too concentrated, like trying to drink seawater when dying of thirst. His vision blurred, the ornate chapel tilting sideways as his small body tried to process toxicity that had been years in the making. Maya caught him as he collapsed, her strong baker's arm steady against his shaking, while Iris moved with swift purpose to gather the released Squanchers before they could rise. The fever that followed lasted 3 days, Finn's body burning as it tried to transform poison, too concentrated for healing. Iris tended him with herbal teas and cool cloths, while Maya sat beside his bed, her presence like an anchor in the storm of his delirium. Through it all he dreamed of bells that rang with the sound of breaking glass, of love that had learned to wear cruelty's face so perfectly that even its victims couldn't recognize the difference. When the fever finally broke, leaving him weak but clear-headed, Finn understood something that couldn't have been learned any other way. Some love was not merely tainted, but fundamentally broken, corrupted beyond the capacity for simple absorption and transformation. He had tried to heal something that didn't wish to be healed, a darkness that was chosen rather than accidental. Some poisons are meant to be recognized, not consumed, Iris explained gently, knowing when to step back, when to protect your own light. That wisdom is as profound as any healing. The ribbon at his wrist caught afternoon light as he sat up for the first time in days, and he understood that compassion and rescue weren't the same thing. Some battles weren't his to fight, and sometimes the greatest act of healing was acknowledging that certain wounds were too deep, certain loves too twisted, to be mended by a single touch. The carriage wheels found their familiar rhythm on the coastal road back to Saltmere, each turn of the axle carrying them further from the oppressive grandeur of Thornfield Manor and closer to the salt-sweetened air that had always meant home. Finn sat quietly against the worn cushions, his body still humming with the aftershocks of concentrated poison, while Maya's steady presence beside him felt like an anchor in waters that had grown too deep too quickly. Iris dozed across from them, her weathered hand still clutching the unopened letter of payment they'd refused. Some services, she'd explained to the bewildered servants, couldn't be purchased with gold, especially when the love they'd been asked to bless had already been murdered by the very people requesting benediction. Back in the cottage, recovery moved through Finn like tide returning to familiar shores, slow and certain, but carrying new understanding in its wake. The herb garden welcomed him with scents of lavender and sea salt that seemed to wash the lingering taste of malice from his senses, while the returned bells on Iris's shelves appeared almost gentle now, their accumulated poison manageable after encountering toxicity so pure it had nearly overwhelmed his gift entirely. Maya arrived each morning with fresh bread and patient companionship, her flour-dusted hands steady as she helped him rebuild strength that went deeper than mere physical recovery. She became his teacher in ways neither of them fully acknowledged, showing him through quiet example what healthy love looked like when it wasn't performing for anyone's approval. Maya would arrive not because he needed saving, but because she enjoyed his company, sharing stories from the bakery, while he listened with the deep attention of someone learning that genuine affection didn't require constant rescue or dramatic gesture. Her presence felt like warm bread cooling on windowsills, nourishing and uncomplicated, available without demand or expectation of transformation in return. When Iris began his lessons again, she placed 3 bells on a folded cloth in his lap, one glowing with easy silver touched by manageable worry, one mottled with years of unspoken tensions, and one nearly black with concentrated malevolence. "Choose," she said simply, her voice level as evening tide, "and tell me why." Finn rested his fingers on the gentle bell, feeling its small ache, understanding he could help but perhaps didn't need to if the couple learned to speak before their worry hardened. The mottled bell questioned him with its accumulated silence, asking if he could truly hear what had been left unsaid. The black bell he left untouched, its darkness pulsing like thunder waiting to break. "Good," Iris nodded when he explained his choices. We will not teach your gift to mistake endurance for love. The first couple who came after his illness carried a returned squancher, tarnished like storm clouds deciding whether to break. Instead of lifting their bell immediately, Finn placed it on the kitchen table between them, surprised at the simple certainty that rose in his chest. Tell it what you haven't told each other, he suggested gently. Let the bell hear first. They looked startled by permission to speak honestly. The man talked about money, but beneath his words lay quiet shame at failing someone he loved. The woman spoke about time, but really meant feeling unseen while being watched every day. The bell did what bells were meant to do. It listened, absorbing what had nowhere else to go. When Finn finally lifted it, the toxicity that flowed toward him was smaller, softened by honesty already shared, and he let only a measured portion pass through before setting the bell down with hands that didn't tremble. Maya waited in the doorway, her breathing lining up with his, in the comfortable synchronization of people who'd learned to exist peacefully in the same space. After the couple left with faces brighter than they'd arrived, she put the kettle on and sliced an apple with small, even strokes, her movements carrying the unhurried grace of someone who understood that healing happened in ordinary moments as much as dramatic ones. Finn felt gratitude rise in him, not the feverish gratitude of rescue, but the clean kind that came from being offered exactly what he could carry. His gift evolved from absorption to discernment, from healing to prevention. Instead of carrying others' transformed poison in his bones, he learned to help people identify their own patterns before they hardened into habits requiring outside intervention. The ribbon at his wrist caught evening light as he walked the shoreline with Maya, no longer marking him as someone who carried the world's sorrows, but as someone who'd learned the difference between compassion and martyrdom, between love that needed tending and love that had been weaponized beyond repair. In the growing dusk, harbor bells sounded their familiar evening song, and Finn understood that his near destruction at Thornfield had been necessary education. Some love was meant to be healed, some was meant to be recognized and avoided, and the wisdom to know the difference was perhaps the most valuable gift he could offer. Maya's laughter drifted like the scent of rising bread, reminding him that even those who help others heal deserve relationships built on joy rather than need, presence rather than rescue, love that asked nothing more than the simple pleasure of existing together in the same gentle world. Spring arrived carrying letters like seeds on favorable winds, each envelope bearing the careful script of village elders who'd heard whispers of Saltmere's young bellkeeper. The requests came wrapped in pressed flowers and local honey, accompanied by stories of couples whose love had grown heavy with unspoken fears, whose wedding bells rang with notes too sharp for celebration. Iris spread the correspondence across her kitchen table like a map of human longing, her weathered fingers tracing routes that would take Finn beyond familiar tides for the first time since his recovery from the Thornfield poison. Each place will teach you something different about love's sickness, she explained, selecting 3 letters that felt manageable, not too far from home, not too desperate in their pleading. Maya listened from the doorway, her baker's intuition already calculating travel time and provisions, her heart quietly measuring whether it could manage separation without growing bitter at the edges. She packed his satchel with unhurried precision, bread wrapped in clean cloth, cheese, apples, and a small jar of honey, because healing should include sweetness. The first invitation came from a mountain settlement where stone houses clung to cliffsides like determined flowers, their windows glowing amber against granite walls. Here tradition weighed so heavily it could crush individual dreams beneath generations of expectation. The wedding belonged to a weaver whose hands created patterns that seemed to capture starlight, and a young shepherd whose songs could call lost lambs from miles away. But beneath their obvious affection lay something that made Finn's chest tighten with recognition, the slow suffocation of dreams abandoned before they could take root, individual desires buried beneath family obligation until they fossilized into quiet resentment. When the moment came for Squancher release, Finn felt the familiar opening in his chest encounter something different from Saltmere's usual poisons. The toxicity here wasn't sharp jealousy or controlling possession, but a crushing weight, the accumulated pressure of 5 generations who'd decided what love should look like without asking what the lovers actually wanted. Instead of immediately absorbing their burden, Finn found himself speaking softly to the gathering, his words carrying the conversational wisdom Iris had taught him. He spoke about forests thriving not when all trees grew identical, but when each found its own reach toward sunlight. The bride's grip on her carved wooden squancher softened as understanding passed between the couple, like morning light touching water. When their bells finally rose into mountain air, Finn absorbed only the smallest portion of their transformed fear, helping them recognize their own capacity to honor tradition while choosing their individual path within it. The river delta taught him about stagnation disguised as devotion, where couples loved deeply but feared change so profoundly they strangled growth before it could begin. Their squanchers were woven from river reeds, carrying the scent of damp earth and forgotten stories. Finn learned to help people release not just their bells, but their grip on unchanging sameness, speaking gently about rivers needing to shed old banks to find new fertile ground. Between journeys, Maya's letters found him in every village, as if paper knew how to follow the scent of someone's name. She wrote about dough that rose faster on storm days, children pressing noses to bakery glass, the way gulls sometimes flew inland when they wanted quiet. Between ordinary details, she tucked questions like smooth stones. What do you say for yourself? Do you ever miss saying no? He carried her words in his pocket, taking them out when markets emptied and lanterns burned low. Each ceremony added layers to his understanding. In a coastal village north of Saltmere, he encountered isolation so profound that people clung to any affection, losing the ability to recognize when love had curdled into desperate dependency. His gift evolved from pure absorption to something more nuanced, helping couples identify their own patterns before they hardened into habits requiring outside intervention. He began carrying a small notebook, recording not accomplishments but observations: copper taste jealousy, rope twist obligation, mirror hunger for admiration. Under each, he noted simple counterweights: honest conversation, rest, permission to be ordinary, shared silence without lessons attached. By summer's end, Finn returned to Saltmere with hands that had learned to read different textures of love's illnesses, eyes that could see past celebration to deeper currents moving beneath. Maya met him at the harbor with bread still warm from morning baking, her smile carrying relief that felt like coming home to himself. The cottage welcomed him with familiar scents of lavender and returned bells, while Iris studied his face with the careful attention of someone measuring both growth and cost. His reputation had grown during the traveling season, but more importantly, his wisdom had deepened. He understood now that healing others required first understanding the many ways love could be wounded, and that some communities needed their bellkeepers to be teachers as much as healers. The ribbon at his wrist caught evening light as he walked the shoreline with Maya, no longer marking him simply as someone who carried others' sorrows, but as someone learning to help people recognize their own strength, their own capacity for choosing healthier love. The weeks after his return settled into Finn like familiar tides, each day bringing couples with bells tarnished by ordinary confusions that he could now help transform through gentle questions rather than pure absorption. His notebook grew thick with observations: copper taste jealousy, rope twist obligation, mirror hunger for admiration. Each entry a lesson in the intricate ways hearts could wound and be wounded. Yet beneath this growing wisdom, something restless moved in his chest, subtle as an undertow that tugs at ankles even on calm days. The realization arrived during a ceremony for Lena, a nurse whose hands smelled of citrus soap and late-night coffee, and Orin, who played piano in the harbor tavern and listened to storms as if taking dictation. From their first greeting, Finn sensed something familiar in their connection. Lena had become everyone's safe harbor, Orin's most of all, and somewhere along the way she'd stopped asking who might be safe for her. The air around them carried the taste of water kept too long on the boil, clean, but leaving the mouth dry. As they prepared to release their squanchers, Finn felt the old reflex spark, the urge to absorb quickly, to make it easier for everyone, to be the endless quiet where sharpness goes to soften. But his hand paused, and in that pause lived the beginning of understanding. He watched Lena's shoulders rise when she laughed, noticed they never quite fell afterward, her body confessing that rest kept being postponed. He saw devotion dressed as need in Orin's face, not unkind but heavy. Instead of reaching for their bells immediately, Finn spoke with the conversational wisdom Iris had taught him. Before you let them go, tell your bells who holds you when you're tired. Tell them who asks for you without asking you to disappear. The couple's faces changed as honest recognition passed between them like morning light touching water. They spoke haltingly at first, then with growing clarity, about errands that had become a life, songs that were really requests, the difference between being relied upon and being loved. Only then did Finn absorb what they couldn't carry, a pale, persistent stream of need that had run too long, softened now by their shared honesty. The bells rose clear and human, carrying relief rather than desperation. Walking home, Finn should have felt proud. Instead, the ceremony's aftertaste followed him like a small, honest shadow. He recognized with startling tenderness how closely Lena's patterns resembled his own, how easily he offered endless harbor, how rarely he asked where he might anchor. Maya was waiting at the cottage with soup thickening on the stove, bread cooling with 2 slices set aside in her thoughtful way. They ate in the comfortable silence of work well done, then stood shoulder to shoulder washing dishes, water running warm over their fingers. The ordinary intimacy of the moment made space for truth. I think I keep loving the world by putting myself on hold, Finn said without preface, his words simple as the plates in their hands. I'm afraid if I stop doing that, I won't know what's left. Maya set a dish gently in the rack, letting silence have its rightful turn. When she spoke, her voice carried the kitchen warmth she used for kneading and comfort. Maybe the part of you that loves the world is asking for a chair. Not to stop loving, just to do it sitting down sometimes. Her smile flickered. I don't need you to be a well. I need you to be a person who laughs at the wrong moment and forgets where he set his tea. I like your company more than your magic. Something eased in Finn's chest. Not a cure, nothing so tidy, but a loosening like a knot, remembering it was just rope. He'd been measuring love by how much harm he could remove from it, instead of by how much ordinary joy it could hold without performing. The fear that had pressed against his ribs for years, that his tenderness was only useful if it lifted weight, found a doorway and stepped outside for air. Later, Finn climbed to his small room and chose a plain bell from Iris's collection of unused squanchers, placing it on his windowsill where moonlight could find it. This one is mine, he told the quiet, not as claim but as promise. He would let some ceremonies pass without him. He would refuse to drink what others insisted he swallow. He would keep a portion of his own quiet unspent and call it not selfishness but stewardship. In his notebook he wrote 3 lines without explanation. Ask before helping. Let joy be ordinary. Leave some songs unsung. The ribbon at his wrist caught starlight as he settled into sleep, no longer marking him simply as someone who carried sorrows, but as someone learning that healthy love was its own form of healing, steady as lighthouse beams, reliable as bread rising, sweet as honey shared between people who chose each other from delight rather than desperation. The weeks following his quiet revelation with Maya settled into Finn like familiar tides, returning to known shores, each morning bringing the gentle weight of his notebook's new wisdom. Ask before helping. Let joy be ordinary. Leave some songs unsung. His plain bell remained on the windowsill, catching dawn light like a promise kept to himself, while downstairs the cottage filled with the comfortable sounds of Iris humming over her herb garden, and Maya's soft knock announcing fresh bread and unhurried companionship. The request arrived not by elaborate letter but through footsteps on the garden path. Hesitant as someone learning to walk on uncertain ground, Nella stood at the gate with hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale as sea foam. Her voice scraped thin when she spoke. There would be a ceremony by the salt marshes in 3 days, she explained. The kind of union everyone claimed was blessed by Providence itself. He saved me, she whispered, the word carrying the brittle shine of something beautiful that cuts when touched. But I keep getting smaller, and I don't know why. Finn felt the familiar stirring in his chest, not the old reflex to absorb immediately, but something newer and more careful, like testing water temperature before diving. Do you want me to help? He asked gently, the first of his new questions settling into the space between them. Nella's eyes flinched from the kindness in his tone, as if tenderness itself might blister, but she nodded once, quick and desperate as someone grabbing for driftwood in deep water. They met by the marsh the morning before the ceremony, where reed beds combed the wind into whispers, and her wedding veil hung over her arm like a surrendered flag. She told him pieces with careful precision, as if speaking too loudly might shatter some spell, holding everything precariously in place. Her fiancé had noticed her when no one else did, remembered her favorite tea, offered shelter when her world had crumbled. But every kindness came with gentle correction. Every comfort carried instruction on how to be grateful properly, until she could barely recognize her own voice beneath layers of learned appreciation. "Everyone says devotion changes you," Nella said, her smile never reaching eyes that had grown distant as marsh water before storms. "I thought that was what it meant to be loved." Finn listened with the deep attention he'd learned from years of holding returned bells, hearing not just what was present, but what had been carefully taken away, piece by piece, until only the shape of absence remained. When he touched their prepared squanchers, delicate, paper birds with silver bells polished to mirror brightness, Finn encountered something that made his newly developed wisdom recoil. The toxicity wasn't the familiar bitterness of jealousy or control, but something more insidious. Love used as erosion, kindness weaponized into disappearance, rescue that required the rescued to vanish completely into gratitude. Instead of reaching immediately to absorb, Finn placed his palm over his own plain bell, anchored by the small promise he'd made to himself in moonlight. "If no one were watching," he asked softly, his voice carrying the conversational wisdom Iris had taught him, "what would your hands choose?" Nella's fingers, which had been gripping the ribbon since arrival, slowly loosened as understanding passed between them like morning light touching still water. She didn't answer with words, but her shoulders dropped for the first time in months, and the marsh seemed to breathe with her. The ceremony drew curious villagers who'd heard whispers of romance rescued from tragedy, but Finn felt the wrongness immediately. Not sharp poison, but something worse, the absence where authentic feeling should live. When the moment came for Squancher release, instead of absorbing what couldn't be carried, Finn found himself speaking with quiet authority that surprised even him. "Before these bells rise," he said, his voice reaching every corner of the gathered quiet, "may we ask what they're meant to carry away?" The question landed like a stone dropped in still water, ripples spreading through the assembly, as people realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Nella's practiced smile wavered, then cracked entirely. "I don't know what I feel anymore," she whispered, the first honest words anyone had heard her speak in months. "I don't know if I feel anything at all." The Squanchers never rose that day. Instead, Nella stepped back from the altar, setting her bell down with movements careful as someone learning to trust their own hands again. The gathering dispersed quietly, not with scandal, but with the relieved exhaustion of people who'd been holding their breath too long and finally remembered how to exhale. Walking home along familiar tide lines, Finn carried no absorbed toxicity in his bones because there had been none to transform, only the clean ache of witnessing honesty after years of performance. His gift had evolved again, from healing to teaching to something more profound, the wisdom to help people recognize when love had moved beyond ceremony's reach, when the greatest compassion was permission to stop pretending and start grieving. The ribbon at his wrist caught evening light as he understood that sometimes the most healing thing a bellkeeper could do was help people choose not to ring the bells at all, to walk away from love that had become a beautiful lie and find courage to seek something real. Maya's laughter drifted from the cottage like the scent of rising bread, reminding him that even those who help others heal deserve relationships built on joy rather than rescue, presence rather than need. The evening after Nella's ceremony that never was settled into Finn like a tide, returning to familiar shores, carrying with it the clean ache of witnessing someone choose truth over performance. He sat with Maya on the cottage steps, sharing an apple cut into careful slices, while harbor lights flickered like earthbound stars, and the weight of what had happened found its proper shape in the growing dusk. Neither spoke about the morning's events immediately. Some truths needed time to breathe, like bread rising in warm kitchens or understanding settling into bones that had carried too much for too long. Maya's presence beside him felt different now, not changed but newly recognized, like discovering that something beautiful had been growing in your garden all along. He watched her hands move with their familiar precision, flour still dusting her knuckles from the day's baking, and understood with startling clarity that what he'd been helping others find, love built on choice rather than need, partnership rooted in strength rather than rescue, had been quietly flourishing between them for years. "I keep thinking about what you said," Maya murmured, offering him another slice, "about helping people find their own voices instead of carrying what they can't bear." Her words carried the kitchen warmth she used for both comfort and difficult conversations. Maybe that's what real love does too, helps us remember who we were before we learned to disappear. The truth of it settled into Finn like seeds finding fertile ground. His gift had evolved from absorption through discernment to something more profound. The wisdom to recognize healthy love when he saw it, to choose it for himself rather than simply teaching others to seek it. The plain bell on his windowsill caught the last light through the cottage window, a reminder of promises kept to himself, while inside Iris hummed over her evening tea with the contentment of someone who'd watched wisdom take root in unlikely soil. Later, as they stood side by side washing the supper dishes, warm water running over their fingers, in the comfortable rhythm they'd perfected over years of shared evenings, Finn felt certainty rise in him, like morning light touching still water. Not the dramatic surge of absorbed emotion, but something quieter and more sure. The recognition that every version of his future he wanted to keep included her steady presence, her unhurried laughter, the way she saw him clearly without needing him to be anything other than exactly who he was. "Maya," he said softly, not breaking the gentle rhythm of their shared task, "I've been thinking about ceremonies and what they're meant to celebrate." He set a clean bowl in the drying rack, his voice carrying the conversational wisdom Iris had taught him. Not the performance of love, but the decision to tend it like a garden that grows best with gentle attention. She paused in her washing, soap bubbles catching lamplight like tiny stars, and turned to study his face with the careful attention she usually reserved for measuring flour and timing bread. Something in his expression made her smile before he'd even finished speaking. "I don't need you to save me," Finn continued, the words coming with surprising ease. "And you don't need me to be anything more than who I am right now. But I'd like to choose you anyway, from delight rather than desperation. Would you marry me, Maya? Would you help me build the kind of life we've been practicing all along?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way her whole face softened with uncomplicated joy, like bread rising perfectly on the first try. "Yes," she whispered finally, the single word carrying more weight than elaborate vows. "Yes to this kind of life. Yes to choosing each other from strength instead of need." They told Iris over tea that tasted faintly of mint and sea air, and the older woman's eyes softened into the exact shape of blessing without theatrics. She reached behind a row of jars and brought out a narrow, well-worn ribbon the color of tide at dusk. "It held my vows once," she said, tying it loosely around Maya's wrist with hands that understood both endurance and release. Not to bind, but to remind that love grows strongest when it's freely given. As they began planning their simple ceremony, squanchers that would carry gratitude rather than fear, bells crafted from driftwood and sea glass, already transformed by time and tide, Finn understood that his greatest healing had come not from absorbing others' poison, but from learning to love himself enough to choose joy over duty, partnership over performance. The ribbon at Maya's wrist caught firelight as they sat together making lists, no longer marking time until healing could begin, but celebrating love that had already learned to flourish in the ordinary, magic of being chosen for exactly who they were. The weeks following their engagement settled into Finn and Maya like familiar tides returning to known shores, each day bringing small preparations that felt more like tending a shared garden than orchestrating a performance. They chose the harbour bluff, where morning light first touched Saltmere, the same place where Finn had absorbed his first wedding toxins as a child. But now it would witness something unprecedented, a ceremony designed not to heal poison, but to celebrate love that had never needed saving. Maya continued her dawn baking, while Finn worked with couples whose bells required gentle attention. But now their separate tasks carried the quiet anticipation of people building something together. Evenings found them at Iris's kitchen table with notebooks and tea, planning simple rituals that would honor what they'd already been practicing. Partnership rooted in strength rather than need, devotion that asked them to grow rather than disappear. Their squanchers took shape with materials gathered from years of patient collecting. Instead of delicate paper birds designed to absorb poison, they crafted bells from sea glass, tumbled smooth by countless tides, and driftwood polished silver by salt and time. Maya's hands, skilled from shaping bread, proved equally gifted at creating vessels meant to carry gratitude outward rather than draw darkness inward. Each bell caught morning light like captured stars, designed to reflect joy rather than contain sorrow. Word of their approaching ceremony spread through Saltmere with the gentle persistence of morning fog, carrying news not of elaborate celebration, but of something rarer, a wedding where both people had already learned to love well. Neighbors offered help with the casual generosity of people who'd watched Finn grow from a quiet child who calmed crying babies to a young man whose presence made difficult conversations easier. The Bakers' Guild sent flour for Maya's wedding bread, while fishermen volunteered to string lanterns along the harbour path. The morning of their ceremony dawned with crystalline clarity, the kind of light that made everything appear newly washed by starlight. Maya wore a dress the colour of sea foam, while Finn chose the simple fisherman's tunic that had always felt most like himself. As they walked to the bluff together, the plain bell from his windowsill rested in his pocket, not as protection, but as reminder of promises kept to himself. The village gathered in the natural amphitheatre of dune grass and stone, arranging themselves with the easy intimacy of people who'd shared storms and celebrations. Iris stood with the village elder near an arch, woven from seagrass and wildflowers, both wearing the quiet contentment of people who trusted simple things to hold profound meaning. Even Nella came, choosing a seat where afternoon light touched her face, her presence a gentle testament to the courage of beginning again after choosing truth over performance. When the ceremony began, the elder spoke with conversational wisdom about promises that grow stronger through daily tending. "Choose kindness when you're tired," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered quiet. "Choose listening when the easy thing would be to fix. Choose to let love be ordinary and beautiful at the same time." Iris stepped forward then, tying the tide-colored ribbon gently around both their wrists for a moment, not to bind but to remind, her smile like a lighthouse beam in the soft afternoon air. Their vows felt like comfortable clothes, made for living rather than display. Maya promised to make room for his quiet without trying to fill it, to ask before helping, to choose him from delight rather than need. Finn promised to share his strength when the world felt heavy, and to tell the truth about when he needed to rest, to love her completely without requiring her to become smaller to fit inside his dreams. When the moment came for the Squanchers, there was no urgency, no scanning for hidden poison. Finn held his sea glass bell, smooth as worrystone, clear as morning water, and felt only gratitude flowing through him. He whispered thanks into its hollow heart, for mornings that smelled like flour and salt, for the patient way she waited while he found words, for a body that had learned when to rest, and a heart that had discovered how to ask permission before giving everything away.
They released their bells together, watching them rise into afternoon sky with notes so clear they seemed to cleanse the very air. No sting, no rush of absorbed darkness, just pure sound that rang with the clarity of water poured over warm hands. The bells caught sunlight as they climbed, their chimes blending with harbor waves until the whole bluff felt gently stitched to the horizon by music. Around them, faces softened almost imperceptibly. Children stopped their restless fidgeting. Even the gulls seemed to quiet their usual raucous commentary, as if recognizing something sacred in the sound of love that had learned to ring without requiring anyone to bleed for its beauty. As evening settled like a gentle blessing and lanterns began to flicker along the harbour path, Finn understood that his greatest gift had never been absorbing others' poison, but learning to recognize love that didn't need healing, only space to flourish according to its own natural rhythms. The ribbon at Maya's wrist caught starlight as they walked home together, no longer marking time until transformation could begin, but celebrating love that had already learned to thrive in the ordinary magic of being chosen completely, joyfully, and without reservation. The weeks following their sea glass ceremony settled into Finn and Maya, like familiar tides returning to known shores, each morning bringing the gentle discoveries of people who'd chosen to build something together rather than simply survive apart. Their cottage, expanded with Maya's warm presence and the easy rhythms of shared life, began drawing visitors not seeking dramatic healing, but curious about the quieter art of tending love before it required rescue. It started naturally, the way most meaningful things do, with young couples lingering after ceremonies to ask gentle questions.
How did you know?
They would wonder, watching Finn and Maya move around each other with the unconscious grace of people who'd learned to make space without losing themselves. Maya would invite them for tea that tasted of mint and sea air, while Finn found himself offering not absorption of their fears, but something more valuable, permission to examine their relationships without shame, to speak honestly about what they hope to build together. Maya suggested they formalize these conversations, opening their Tuesday evenings to anyone curious about love's practical mysteries. They moved Iris's long table to the cottage's heart, adding benches worn smooth by years of shared meals and stories. The shelves of returned bells remained, but now they served as teaching tools rather than repositories of absorbed sorrow. Beside them sat a collection of plain practice bells, unburdened and ready for learning. The first official evening brought 6 young people, cheeks flushed with the courage required to seek wisdom about matters of the heart. Rowan arrived with wood shavings still clinging to his sleeves, speaking quietly about a sweetheart who measured love by the scale of sacrifices demanded. Isla, bright as morning light, asked how to distinguish between patience and slowly disappearing into someone else's expectations. Tavi carried his father's worries along with the inherited fishing boat, his love tangled with protective instincts that had begun to feel more like rope than refuge. Instead of absorbing their concerns, Finn taught them to place practice bells on the table before difficult conversations, letting the bells serve as witnesses rather than vessels for pain. "Tell it what you haven't told each other," he would suggest gently, watching as honesty transformed fear into manageable truth. When someone reached reflexively to have their burden lifted, Finn would touch his own plain bell, still kept nearby as reminder, and the room would remember to pause. Not everything that hurt needed immediate healing. Sometimes it needed patient examination first. Maya contributed her baker's wisdom with the same generosity she brought to morning bread. "Love is like dough," she would say, flour dusting her hands as she shaped tomorrow's loaves. "Push too hard, and you get something dense and bitter. Trust the process, give it room to breathe, and you get nourishment that lasts." Her practical metaphors grounded Finn's more ethereal insights, making abstract concepts of healthy relationships feel as tangible as warm bread cooling on windowsills. Their approach spread through Saltmere's network of fishermen's wives and market vendors, carrying news not of dramatic intervention, but of something rarer, practical education about building love that didn't require constant repair. Soon, their circle expanded to include engaged couples practicing honesty before their ceremonies, newlyweds navigating first disagreements, even longtime partners wanting to tend their connections before they accumulated the kind of poison that demanded outside healing. Finn's gift evolved from absorption to prevention, from healing individual crises to helping entire communities recognize love's healthy patterns. He learned to identify relationships beginning to turn toxic, forced laughter, compliments carrying barbs, the creeping silence that preceded years of unspoken resentment. But instead of waiting to absorb accumulated poison, he taught couples to recognize these signs themselves, to choose conversation over silence, honesty over performance. As autumn painted the harbor in shades of amber and rust, Finn realized they'd created something unprecedented, a community where healthy love was taught alongside practical skills, where children grew up understanding that relationships required tending like gardens rather than conquering like battles. The village felt different now. Arguments resolved more easily. Sleeping babies turned toward the sound of his evening walks. Couples moved through their days with the easy grace of people who'd learned to ask for what they needed instead of waiting to be rescued or peace. Ribbon at Maya's wrist caught firelight as she kneaded bread. For the next day's customers, her movements carrying the unhurried confidence of someone who'd learned that profound change often happened through patient accumulation of small, wise choices. Outside, harbour bells sounded their evening song, and Finn understood that his greatest gift had never been carrying others' sorrows alone, but learning to love well enough to teach that same skill, not through dramatic healing, but through the quiet example of choosing joy, partnership, and growth over the familiar patterns that had once required transformation. The seasons following their sea glass ceremony moved through Saltmere like gentle tides returning to familiar shores, each turning bringing deeper understanding of what it meant to tend love as gardeners tend soil, with patience, attention, and the wisdom to know when growth requires space rather than intervention. Finn's hair began showing silver threads that caught morning light like captured starlight, while Maya's hands grew even more skilled at both shaping bread and guiding the difficult conversations that had become part of their Tuesday evening gatherings. Their cottage had expanded again, not with rooms but with purpose. The long table now accommodated 12 people comfortably, surrounded by benches worn smooth by years of shared stories and gentle revelations. The collection of practice bells had grown too, each one representing someone who'd learned to carry their own emotional weight rather than seeking rescue. Beside them, Iris's returned bells remained as teaching tools, their tarnished surfaces telling stories of love's many disguises without requiring Finn to absorb their accumulated sorrows. Winter settled over the village with the kind of crystalline quiet that made every sound precious. On evenings when frost painted the windows with delicate patterns, their gatherings took on an even deeper intimacy. Rowan arrived with wood shavings still clinging to his sleeves, now helping other young men distinguish between protective love and possessive control. Isla, bright as morning light, had learned to catch the first fevers of idealization and cool them with questions that invited nuance rather than judgment. Tavi, patient as tide, reminded the stubborn that love wasn't a test to pass, but a practice to return to, again and again. Finn watched them with the quiet awe of someone witnessing his work evolve beyond his own hands. These weren't apprentices in any formal sense, but people who'd absorbed the Saltmere way through patient observation and practice. When couples arrived seeking dramatic intervention, it was often Rowan or Isla who suggested they place a practice bell on the table and speak honestly before anyone tried to fix anything. The gift was spreading naturally, like seeds carried on favorable winds. Iris moved through the cottage with the distilled grace of someone who'd learned when to step back and let new growth claim its space. Her weathered hands still carried warmth, but now she offered guidance rather than direct service, her voice lighter, but her words carrying the same steadying weight. "You've taught them to come home before they're broken," she told Finn one evening, watching a young couple practice honesty with each other instead of seeking rescue. That's a rare trick. The village itself had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Children grew up seeing their parents resolve disagreements through conversation rather than silence, watching neighbors offer help without expectation of dramatic gratitude. The rate of returned bells had dropped significantly, not because Finn's absorption skills had improved, but because couples were learning to recognize and address their own patterns before they hardened into habits requiring outside intervention. Maya's role had evolved too, her baker's wisdom now sought by young mothers learning to balance partnership with parenthood, her kitchen serving as an unofficial counseling center where practical metaphors made abstract concepts feel as tangible as warm bread cooling on windowsills. "Love is like dough," she would say, flour dusting her hands as she shaped tomorrow's loaves. Push too hard and you get something dense and bitter. Trust the process, give it room to breathe, and you get nourishment that lasts. As they aged together, their approach continued evolving from intervention to observation, from teaching specific techniques to modeling the kind of partnership that made healthy relationships seem not only possible but natural. Young couples would watch them move through ordinary tasks, Maya humming while Finn organized the practice bells, both of them pausing to share an apple, sliced with careful precision and understand, without words, what it looked like when two people chose each other. Daily from strength rather than need, Finn's gift had become less about absorption and more about recognition, helping people see their own patterns clearly enough to choose different paths. When someone reached reflexively to have their burden lifted, he would touch his own plain bell, still kept nearby as reminder, and the room would remember to pause. Not everything that hurt needed immediate healing. Sometimes it needed patient examination first. The ribbon at Maya's wrist caught firelight as she kneaded bread for the next day's customers, her movements carrying the unhurried confidence of someone who'd learned that profound change often happened through patient accumulation of small, wise choices. Outside, harbour bells sounded their evening song, and Finn understood that his greatest gift had never been his capacity for absorption, but his willingness to learn, to grow, to choose love that asked him to become more himself rather than less. In his notebook, he recorded not individual triumphs but patterns he'd observed, wisdom that could be passed to future generations. The village slept more peacefully now, not because he carried their sorrows in his bones, but because they'd learned to tend their own hearts with the same gentle attention they brought to gardens, children, and all the precious things that flourished best when given space to grow according to their own natural rhythms. The spring that would mark the end of one season and the beginning of another arrived, with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything in Saltmere appear newly washed by starlight. Finn stood at the cottage window, his hair now more silver than brown, watching the village wake to rhythms he'd helped establish but no longer needed to guide directly. The Tuesday evening gatherings ran themselves now, Rowan and Isla and Tavi leading conversations with the quiet authority of people who'd learned to trust their own discernment about love's many textures. Maya moved through their kitchen with the unhurried grace of someone who'd learned that profound moments often dressed themselves in ordinary clothes, preparing tea that tasted faintly of mint and sea air. Today would mark something unprecedented in Saltmere's history. Not Finn's final ceremony as bellkeeper, but his first ceremony as pure witness, standing present without the weight of absorption settling into his bones. The ceremony belonged to Cora and Willem, both in their early 20s, faces bright with the particular courage of people who'd grown up watching love tended like gardens rather than conquered like battles. They'd attended Tuesday evening gatherings since their engagement, practicing honesty with each other under Rowan's patient guidance, learning to recognize the early signs of patterns that might later require healing. Cora worked with her hands, weaving nets that could hold the sea's abundance without breaking, while Willem carved small boats that rode waves with the same graceful resilience his words carried when he spoke about the future they were building together. As the village gathered on the familiar bluff where Finn had absorbed his first wedding toxins as a child, he felt the deep satisfaction of circles completing themselves. Iris moved through the crowd with the distilled grace of someone who'd learned when to step back and let new growth claim its space. Her weathered hands carrying a basket of practice bells, each one representing someone who'd learned to carry their own emotional weight rather than seeking rescue. The transformation was visible in faces, Throughout the gathering, parents resolved disagreements through conversation rather than silence. Children played with the easy confidence of those who'd never seen love used as weapon, and couples moved through their preparations with the comfortable intimacy of people who'd learned to ask for what they needed instead of waiting to be rescued. When the moment came for the Squancher release, Finn positioned himself not at the center, but at the gentle edge, close enough to offer guidance if requested, but distant enough to let the ceremony belong completely to those it was meant to serve. Cora and Willem had crafted their Squanchers from materials gathered during months of patient collecting, sea glass tumbled smooth by countless tides, driftwood polished silver by salt and time, reeds that had learned to bend without breaking. Instead of the familiar stirring in his chest, the opening that had once allowed him to absorb others' poison, Finn experienced something rarer and more precious, the clean joy of witnessing love that had never needed saving, only space to flourish according to its own natural rhythms. He watched as Cora lifted her bell, not heavy with accumulated toxins, but light with the small, unnecessary fears that could cloud even the clearest intentions, the worry that her practical nature might not match Willem's dreams, the perfectionism that whispered she should be more graceful, more certain, more something other than exactly who she was. "Before you let them rise," Finn said softly, his voice carrying the conversational wisdom Iris had taught him. "Tell your bells what you're ready to stop carrying. Not poison, just the weight of what love doesn't actually require." Willem spoke first, his words halting but honest. He would release the need to have every answer before taking each step, the fear that uncertainty meant inadequacy. Cora followed, promising to let go of the performance of perfection, the exhausting choreography of being impressive rather than simply present. Their Squanchers rose into afternoon sky, carrying notes that were neither perfectly clear nor sharply discordant, but something more valuable, genuinely human, imperfect, and therefore true. The bells chimed with the particular music of people who'd learned to love themselves enough to stop performing love for others' approval, their voices blending with harbor winds until the whole bluff felt gently stitched to the horizon by sound. Finn felt none of the deep tiredness that had once followed ceremonies, no weight settling into his bones like sediment in still water. Instead, he experienced the profound lightness of someone who'd learned to love his own company as much as he cherished connection, who'd discovered that the greatest gift he could offer wasn't his capacity for absorption, but his willingness to witness others finding their own strength as evening settled like a gentle blessing, and lanterns began to flicker along the harbour path. The village moved toward celebration with faces softened by understanding. Finn found himself walking beside Maya, her hand finding his with the unconscious grace of people who'd chosen each other daily from strength rather than need. "What will you do with all that extra space in your chest?" Maya asked gently, her words carrying the kitchen warmth she used for both comfort and difficult conversations. "Now that you're not carrying everyone's transformed sorrows." Finn smiled, touching the plain bell that still rested in his pocket. No longer protection, but reminder of promises kept to himself. "I think I'll fill it with ordinary joy," he said, his voice light with discovery. "With the sound of your humming in the mornings, with the taste of tea shared at the end of long days, with the particular satisfaction of watching love grow strong without requiring anyone to bleed for its beauty." The ribbon at Maya's wrist caught starlight as they walked home together, no longer marking time until transformation could begin, but celebrating love that had already learned to thrive in the gentle magic of being chosen completely, joyfully, and without reservation. Behind them, the village settled into sleep with the deep contentment of people who'd learned that the greatest healing often happened not through dramatic intervention, but through the patient accumulation of small, wise choices made with love. The years that followed settled into Finn and Maya like familiar tides returning to known shores, each season bringing deeper understanding of what it meant to love without requiring rescue, to heal without absorbing poison into bones that had learned the difference between compassion and martyrdom. Finn's hair had turned completely silver, catching morning light like captured starlight, while Maya moved through their cottage with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that profound moments often dress themselves in ordinary clothes. Fresh bread cooling on windowsills, tea shared in comfortable silence, hands finding each other across decades of choosing partnership from strength rather than need. Behind their cottage, where Iris had once tended herbs with the patience of someone who trusted natural rhythms, they had cultivated something unprecedented in Saltmere's long history. The garden grew from soil mixed with the symbolic ashes of 1,000 transformed sorrows, not literal remains, but the essence of all the toxicity that had once required absorption, now composted into nourishment for new growth. Children played among flowers that seemed to hum with contentment, their laughter teaching without words that love, like gardens, flourished best when given both protection and trust in natural cycles. The cottage itself had evolved into something neither of them had originally imagined, not a place where broken things came to be fixed, but where healthy things came to be celebrated and understood. The long table still accommodated Tuesday evening gatherings, but now Rowan led conversations with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to trust his own discernment, while Isla asked the kind of questions that invited honesty without judgment, and Tavi offered the steady humor that helped people remember love was meant to be enjoyed, not endured. Iris had passed 3 winters ago as quietly as she had lived, her final breath carrying the scent of lavender and sea salt. Her weathered hands had grown still while holding Finn's, her last words a whispered reminder. You learned the leaving, the choosing. Keep a chair for yourself, even in the most crowded rooms. They had buried a length of her tide-colored ribbon beneath the rosemary bush, and every spring the plant lifted its blue flowers as if remembering her gentle wisdom. The transformation of Saltmere was complete, but so gradual it felt like natural growth rather than dramatic change. Wedding ceremonies carried a different quality now, cleaner joy that seemed to heal the very air around them. Squanchers rose into sunset skies, carrying not the poison of desperate love, but the gentle release of unnecessary perfectionism, the small fears that could cloud even the clearest intentions. The bells chimed with notes that were neither perfectly clear nor sharply discordant, but something more valuable, genuinely human, imperfect and therefore true. On the morning of what would unknowingly be his final ceremony, as witness rather than healer, Finn stood at the cottage window watching the village wake to rhythms he'd helped establish, but no longer needed to guide directly. A young couple approached the bluff where he'd absorbed his first wedding toxins as a child, their faces bright with the particular courage of people who'd grown up understanding that relationships required patience rather than performance. As their sea glass squanchers rose into afternoon sky, Finn felt none of the familiar stirring in his chest, no opening that once allowed him to absorb others' burdens. Instead, he experienced something rarer and more precious, the clean joy of witnessing love that had never needed saving, only space to flourish according to its own natural rhythms. The bells carried away not poison, but the small, unnecessary weights that even healthy love sometimes accumulated, the worry of not being enough, the performance of certainty, the exhausting choreography of being impressive rather than simply present. Walking home along tide lines worn smooth by countless returns, Finn understood that his greatest gift had never been his capacity for carrying others' transformed sorrows, but his willingness to learn, to grow, to choose love that asked him to become more himself rather than less. The plain bell from his windowsill now rested on a shelf beside Maya's wedding ribbon, both serving as reminders of promises kept, to love well, to rest when needed, to trust that healing often happened through the patient accumulation of small, wise choices made with love. As evening settled like a gentle blessing, and harbour bells chimed their familiar song, Finn and Maya sat in their garden watching stars emerge over water that reflected their light like scattered coins. The village slept soundly around them, its dreams unburdened, its heart beating with the rhythm of people who'd learned to tend their own love before it required outside intervention. In the growing quiet, surrounded by flowers that had learned to bloom from transformed sorrow, Finn touched Maya's hand and understood that some stories don't end so much as settle into contentment, like tides finding their natural rhythm. Like love learning to be ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, and somewhere in the gentle darkness, the Squanchers continue to rise, carrying not the weight of what love cannot bear, but the simple gratitude of hearts that have learned to choose each other, again and again, from joy rather than need. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's gonna be okay, man.